Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. And I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily, and perhaps much better, be described as a policy of good neighborliness.
What kind of country writes laws that decide where you can live, who you can marry, what schools your children can attend, and even which park bench you're allowed to sit on? All based on the color of your skin. This was not Nazi Germany. It was South Africa. For nearly 50 years, under a system the world came to know as apartheid. Apartheid wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate architecture of laws built piece by piece to privilege one race and crush another. By 1980, a white South African earned 7 times more than a black South African, even though whites made up less than 20% of the population. The government spent 10 times more on a white child education than on a black child education. Land ownership was even worse. Nearly 90% of the land was reserved for whites, while millions of blacks were pushed into barren homelands. And it wasn't hidden. The politicians who designed apartheid said it openly. Hendrik Verwoerd, the prime minister known as the architect of apartheid, once declared, "There is no place for the African in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor."
He was a very, very clever man. But it was clear that black people in South Africa had no position higher than certain forms of labor.
But here's the other half of the story. From the very beginning, black South Africans resisted. They protested, they organized, they built movement, they risked their lives. So, how did this system rise? Why did it survive so long? And why, even after its fall in 1994, does its shadow still hang over South Africa today? This is the story of apartheid, its origin, its architect, its brutal impact, and the resistance that ultimately brought it down. To understand apartheid, you have to go back centuries, to the very birth of South Africa as a society. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a supply station at the Cape of Good Hope. What began as a simple refreshment shop for ships soon became a settler colony. Dutch farmers, later known as Boers and Afrikaners, expanded inland, claiming land and enslaving African and Asian people. By the early 19th century, the British had arrived. They took control of Cape in 1806, clashing with the Boers and the African kingdoms. 2 wars will define this period. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, where the Zulu kingdom resisted but was eventually crushed, and the Anglo-Boer Wars, from 1818 to 1881, from 1899 to 1902, where the British defeated the Afrikaners and imposed their rule. But what truly hardened South Africa's racial hierarchy was not just conquest. It was wealth. The discovery of diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886 transformed the region. Suddenly, the land was the richest mining territory on the planet. But mines needed cheap, abundant labor. And so began a system designed to push black South Africans off their land and into mines, working for starvation wages under brutal conditions. By 1910, when the Union of South Africa was created, the system was already clear. A white-dominated state with black South Africans excluded from voting and stripped of land rights. The 1913 Natives Land Act made it official. Africans who made up nearly 80% of the population were confined to just 7% of the land. One black intellectual, Sol Plaatje, captured the devastation in his diary after the Land Act came into force. Awakening on Friday morning, June 20th, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. He wrote, "It is here, decades before apartheid was finally declared in 1948, that we see its roots. Conquest, dispossession, and a system built to benefit one race at the expense of another. Apartheid, in many ways, was not a new invention. It was the perfection of an old order." Apartheid was not only a system of laws, it was a system of ideas. The Afrikaners who came to dominate South African politics carried with them a powerful narrative that they were a chosen people. Many of them descended from Dutch Calvinists who believed in predestination, the idea that they were divinely ordained to rule. They called themselves the Volktrekkers.
Also, I believe that it is according to God's will that the white race, which is in the majority in this country, should be preserved, and also everything we have done in the last 300 years and built up in the church and in the state should be preserved and not be swallowed up by an, I wouldn't say inferior race, because I don't believe it is an inferior race, but a lesser a race which is in a lesser state of development.
Pioneers who had crossed the wilderness and defeated African kingdoms by God's will. In their eyes, white dominance was not oppression, it was destiny. In the 20th century, this theology fused with racial pseudoscience imported from Europe and America. Thinkers and politicians began to argue that the races were biologically different and therefore must live separately. They borrowed the language of anthropology and sociology to dress up segregation as scientific. This communicated the doctrine of separate development. Instead of admitting it was about exploitation, apartheid architects claimed that each race had the right to develop independently, but of course, on vastly unequal terms. The man most associated with this philosophy was Hendrik Verwoerd, Prime Minister from 1958 to 1966. Known as the architect of apartheid, he presented the system as logical and even benevolent. In 1950, he told Parliament, "The policy of separate development is designed not to exploit the Bantu but to protect him. There is no place for him in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. For that reason, it is no avail for him to receive a training which has at its aim absorption into the European community." In plain language, he was saying, blacks could be rebels, but never equals. This philosophy was embedded not only in speeches but in education. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 deliberately designed inferior schools for black children. Verwoerd put it bluntly, there's no place for the Bantu child in the European community, above the level of certain forms of labor. This was the intellectual heart of apartheid. Theology, pseudoscience, and ideology combining to claim that inequality was natural, that segregation was order, and that oppression was development. But while whites wrote the laws and philosophy to justify oppression, black South Africans were already resisting with their own ideas of unity, dignity, and freedom. Apartheid wasn't just an idea, it was a machine. A machine built out of laws, IDs, police checkpoints, and bulldozers. When the National Party came to power in 1948, it wasted no time. One by one, laws were passed to codify white supremacy and strip black South Africans of even the smallest freedom. The 1949 Prohibition of Mixed Marriage Act banned interracial marriages. Soon after, the Immorality Act criminalized even sexual relations between races. Love itself became illegal. The 1950 Population Registration Act was the foundation of the system. Every South African was classified into one of four categories: white, black, colored, or Indian. This racial identity wasn't a matter of choice. It was stamped onto ID books that controlled every movement and every opportunity. The 1950 Groups Area Act carved South Africa into different zones. Prime lands in cities went to white. Blacks were forcibly removed to townships and homelands. Entire neighborhoods were bulldozed. District 6 in Cape Town, once a vibrant multiracial community, saw 60,000 people uprooted in 1970s. Sophia Town, Johannesburg, was flattened in 1955. The pass laws. Every black South African over 16 had to carry a passbook at all times. Without it, they could be arrested. By the 1960s, hundreds of thousands were detained each year for pass law offenses. Ordinary life was criminalized. The 1953 Bantu Education Act, designed to keep black children in their place. Government spending per pupil was 10 times higher for whites than for blacks. Schools were not a ladder out of poverty or a cage to keep black South Africans trapped in their menial work. And then came the Bantustans. The regime invented homelands. 10 fragmented territories where blacks were told they were citizens. The idea was sinister. Strip them of South African citizenship altogether so whites could claim they weren't oppressing a majority. By the 1980s, more than 3 million people have been forcibly relocated to these barren homelands, while whites retained 87% of the land. This was apartheid genius and cruelty. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Apartheid wasn't random violence. It was violence by law. And yet, for every law passed, there was resistance. Because as apartheid perfected its machinery, black South Africans perfected their defiance. From the very moment apartheid was born, so too was resistance. In fact, resistance to white domination in South Africa began long before 1948. The African National Congress was founded in 1912. Just 2 years after the Union of South Africa was created, its early leaders like Pixika Isaka Iseme, Solplat J, and later Albert Luthuli saw clearly what the 1913 Land Act meant: the dispossession of millions of Africans. By the 1950s, under leaders like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign of 1952. Thousands of volunteers deliberately broke apartheid laws, entering white-only areas, burning passbooks, refusing to carry identification. For this, they were arrested in their thousands, but they showed the world that black South Africans will not quietly accept their fate. In 1955, Congress of the People gathered at Kliptown and adopted the Freedom Charter, a radical vision declaring South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. That document to become the moral foundation of the struggle. But resistance came at a cost. In 1960, the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC, organized a protest against past laws in the township of Sharpeville. Police opened fire on the crowd, killing 69 people and wounding hundreds. Many were shot in the back as they fled. The Sharpeville massacre shocked the world, marked a turning point. The ANC and PAC were banned. Mandela and his comrades went underground, and the struggle turned toward armed resistance. By the 1970s, a new generation rose up. Students led the way. On June 16, 1976, thousands of school children marched through Soweto to protest being forced to learn in Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor. Police responded with bullets. A 13-year-old boy, Hector Peterson, was shot dead. A photograph of his body being carried through the street became one of the most iconic images of the anti-apartheid struggle. That day, hundreds were killed. But Soweto ignited a fire that could not be put out. The resistance was not only physical, it was intellectual. Steve Biko, founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, thought the liberation begins in the mind. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed.
And for black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them, and this was the psychological feeling of inferiority.
Biko's death in police custody in 1977 after brutal beatings turned him into a martyr for the freedom. And resistance spread beyond South Africa. Exiled leaders like Oliver Tambo built global solidarity networks. The world responded with boycotts, South African goods were banned, international sports teams refused to play, artists boycotted cultural events. The United Nations imposed sanctions. By the 1980s, apartheid South Africa had become a pariah state. Resistance was never a single act. It was a long, unbroken chain of defiance. From the Freedom Charter to Sharpeville, from Soweto to Steve Biko, every generation rose to say, we will not be slaves in our own land. Apartheid wasn't just a set of laws on paper. It was a daily reality that shaped where you lived, how you worked, what you earned, and even how you lived. The contrasts were staggering. By the 1980s, a white South African earned on average 7 times to 10 times more than a black South African. Whites, who made up 20% of the population, controlled nearly 90% of the land. Education was one of apartheid's sharpest weapons. In 1975, the government spent 644 rand per white pupil compared to just 42 per black pupil. That's more than 15 times the investment. White children went to school with libraries, laboratories, and qualified teachers. Black children often studied in overcrowded classrooms with little more than chalk and bare walls. Housing told the same stories. While white suburbs enjoyed spacious homes with gardens and paved roads, black families were crammed into townships on the outskirts of cities, with thin shacks, poor sanitation, and little access to running water. Entire communities were uprooted. 3.5 million people were forcibly removed under apartheid's group areas policies, dumped into homelands with no economic base. Healthcare was also segregated. In the 1980s, the ratio of doctors to patients in white areas was 1 to 400. In black rural areas, it was 1 to 44,000. Life expectancy told the story. Whites could live up to their 70s. For blacks, it was closer to 50. And then there was the constant fear. At any moment, police could demand to see a black person's passbook. Failure to produce it meant arrest. In 1962 alone, nearly 384,000 black South Africans were arrested for past law violations. Imagine that, almost 500,000 people criminalized not for a crime, but for simply walking without a paper. Apartheid penetrated even the smallest details of life. There were benches marked Europeans only. Beaches, buses, hospitals, restaurants and cinemas, all segregated. White South Africans could stroll through parks, travel without fare, and enjoy all the privileges of citizenship. Black South Africans were treated as aliens in their own land. The humiliation was relentless, but so too was the resilience of those who endured it. Looking back, one question looms large. How could a system so obviously brutal, so widely condemned, survive for nearly half a century? The answer lies in a web of repression, deception, and global complicity. First, it was maintained by state repression. The apartheid regime was a police state. Protest was met with bullets, dissent with jail cells, and organizing with bannings. The Suppression of Communism Act of 1950 allowed the government to label anyone opposing apartheid as a communist, even if they weren't. The ANC, PAC, and other organizations were banned. Leaders like Nelson Mandela were imprisoned for decades. Mandela himself spent 27 years behind bars, 18 of them on Robben Island. The police had sweeping powers. Raids, detention without trial, torture in custody. Figures like Steve Biko died at their hands. Fear was an everyday weapon. Secondly, divide and rule. Apartheid carved South Africans into artificial nation. The Bantustan system declared that black South Africans were not citizens of South Africa at all, but of separate homelands like Transkei and Venda. This stripped them of political rights in white South Africa and allowed the government to claim that it was not oppressing the majority. By the 1980s, over 3 million people had been relocated to these barren homelands. Thirdly, Cold War politics. In the eyes of the West, apartheid South Africa was not just a racist regime, it was a strategic ally. The United States and Britain, fearing communism, tolerated apartheid because the ANC had ties to socialist and communist allies. Margaret Thatcher once called the ANC a typical terrorist organization. Washington and London preferred apartheid to the risks of leftist South Africa. And fourthly, business interests. South Africa's mines were among the richest in the world. Gold, diamonds, platinum. Multinational corporations and banks had a stake in keeping cheap black labor flowing. Mining companies like Anglo-American depended on apartheid labor system to maximize profit. Foreign investments poured in, propping up the economy and the regime. And finally, ideology. The apartheid regime mastered propaganda. It presented itself as orderly, modern, and even benevolent. Separate development rather than domination. In white communities, many genuinely believed they were defending civilization against chaos. This ideological shield allowed ordinary whites to benefit from apartheid while telling themselves it was justified. Apartheid endured because it was ruthless, well-structured, and globally tolerated. It survived because the state silenced voices, divided people, exploited Cold War fears, and kept money flowing. But also survived because it was resisted. And every act of resistance forced the regime to tighten its grip until it eventually cracked. No system of oppression lasts forever. For apartheid, the beginning of the end came from both inside South Africa and outside its border. Inside the country, resistance grew impossible to contain. The Soweto Uprising of 1976 was a watershed. When school children protested being forced to learn in Afrikaans, the language of their oppressors, the police responded with bullets. The image of 13-year Hector Peterson carried through the streets shocked the world. Hundreds were killed, but Soweto lit a fire that spread to townships across South Africa. Strikes, boycotts, and underground resistance intensified. By the 1980s, mass movements like the United Democratic Front, United Churches, unions, and civic groups against apartheid. Township became ungovernable. The cost of maintaining repression rose sharply. Outside, the world turned against apartheid. The Sheffield massacre has already stained South Africa's image in the 1960s, but by the 1980s, international outreach crystallized into action. Countries imposed economic sanction, cultural boycotts, and sporting bans. Banks pulled loans, multinational companies like Coca-Cola and IBM faced pressure to leave. South African athletes were banned from the Olympics. Even musicians joined in. Remember the global anthem, Free Nelson Mandela? Well, all of those contributed. And yes, the economy began to collapse. Inflation soared, capital fled, sanctions cut off trade, and by 1985, the rand had lost more than half its value. Unemployment rose, businesses shut down, and even white South Africans felt the pinch. The fortress was bleeding. Political shift inside South African ruling class too also mattered. President P.W. Botha tried to reform apartheid at the edges, creating a tricameral parliament that gave token representation to Indians and colored, but excluded blacks. It fooled no one. Protests intensified, and the system was unworkable. By the 1980s, the world was changing too. The Cold War was ending. Excuse that apartheid was a bulwark against communism no longer held. South Africa was isolated, sanctioned, and burning from within. And then came the moment. In February 1990, President F.W. de Klerk stunned the nation by announcing
the prohibition of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, and a number of subsidiary organizations is being rescinded.
After 27 years in prison, Mandela walked free on February 11, 1990, raising his fist, symbolizing not defeat but victory. The next 4 years were tense. Negotiations between the apartheid government and the ANC were fraught with violence. Massacres in township, assassination, right-wing militias trying to derail peace. But the tide was unstoppable. In April 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections. Millions of black South Africans voted for the first time in their lives. Nelson Mandela was elected the country's first black president. Mandela captured the moment with words that echoed around the world. Never, 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 never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience oppression of one by another. And on that day, apartheid was over. Apartheid may have ended in 1994, but its shadow still hangs heavily over South Africa. The laws were dismantled, the passbooks were burned, but inequalities written into the very structure of society could not vanish overnight. South Africa today is one of the most unequal countries on earth. Its Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, hovers around 0.63, among the highest in the world. By 2019, average income of white household was 3 times higher than that of black household. Land reform has moved at a crawl. Whites, just 8% of the population, still own majority of prime farmland. Schools remain deeply unequal. Elite private schools and former Model C schools, historical white schools provided world-class education. Meanwhile, many township and rural schools lack libraries, laboratories, and even toilets. This perpetuates the cycle apartheid created. Privilege passes down while poverty remains trapped. Drive through Johannesburg or Cape Town and you will see it. Leafy suburbs with high walls and swimming pools. Right next to sprawling township like Soweto. This is apartheid urban map still intact. By 2020, nearly 13% of South Africans still live in informal housing. Shacks, often without reliable water or sanitation. National unemployment stands at around 32%, but for black youth it is closer to 60%. Compare that with much lower unemployment among whites, and you see apartheid economic lines still visible in the statistics. South Africa struggles with some of the highest crime rates in the world, partly because economic exclusion breeds desperation. The apartheid state built security for white and insecurity for blacks. Today, the imbalance fuels mistrust and fear across society. Apartheid was not just about economics, it was about dignity. Generations of black South Africans grew up under a system designed to tell them that they were inferior. Undoing that damage is harder than passing laws. As Desmond Tutu said, the past is not the past, it is present, it lives on in us. Apartheid ended in law but not in life. Its legacy is written in land ownership, in classrooms, in suburbs, in unemployment lines. It is a story of victory and survival, but also a warning of how deeply injustice can carve itself into a society. Apartheid was not just a South African tragedy, it was a human one. It showed the world how ideology can be weaponized, how laws can become chains, and how privilege can dress up as order. It revealed how long injustice can last when it is protected by money, fear, and complicity of the powerful. But also showed something else, the resilience of the human spirit. For 50 years, millions of black South Africans lived under a system designed to crush them, and yet they resisted. In classrooms and townships, in strikes and underground meetings, in songs and speeches, in the courage of children in Soweto, in the unbroken spirit of Nelson Mandela on Robben Island. The fall of apartheid was not inevitable. It was won through sacrifice, through solidarity, through persistence. And yet, the story is unfinished. The legal system fell in 1994, but the structures of inequality remain. South Africa today stands as both a miracle, a nation that avoided civil war, and embrace democracy, and a warning: a nation still scared by the architecture of inequality. For Africa and for the world, there are lessons here. First, oppression can be legalized, normalized, and defended with philosophy. You must remain vigilant because injustice does not always wear masks. Second, resistance works, but it takes generation, sacrifice, and vision. And third, dismantling oppression requires more than tearing down laws. It requires building schools, redistributing opportunities, and healing dignity. Mandela put it best on the day of his release: "I've cherished the ideal of a democratic and a free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It's an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it's an ideal for which I'm prepared to die." That ideal of equality, of dignity, of harmony is still the unfinished work of South Africa. May it get there someday. Thank you for watching this episode. Share with someone, like, and subscribe. Until I see you again, bye bye.